She was not the kind to sit at home and be a good wife. She wanted adventure, she wanted fun, she wanted everything. Her life encompassed a huge amount of change: civil war, plague, the Great Fire of London, the restoration of the monarchy, and going back, the Commonwealth. No one really wanted to marry her because not only was she no longer a virgin, but she also still had that problem of not having any money. That the Queen was quite innocent. She innocently welcomed Barbara with grace, and even let her kiss her hand. It was only when one of her Portuguese attendants, her ladies, whispered down to her and said, "That's actually the king's mistress," that Catherine apparently lost control.
Welcome to the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell, and to our latest historian interview. If you've been here before, thank you for coming back. And if this is your first time, thank you for checking out this channel. If you love British history, then you're definitely in the right place. Not only have I got a great interview for you today, but over 40 historian interviews available for you to view on this channel or listen to on the podcast, plus more history videos and virtual tours, and we're adding all the time. But today, I am talking to Andrea Zuvich about her latest book, Ravenous, A Life of Barbara Villiers, Charles II's most infamous mistress. Andrea is an independent 17th century historian and anthropologist specialising in the House of Stuart. She obtained degrees in history and anthropology at the University of Central Florida and is the host of the popular blog, The 17th Century Lady, and has worked as a historical consultant for TV, film, and radio. Andrea was a speaker at our Stuart's Online History Festival earlier this year, where she presented her talk, Royal Mistresses, The Tenuous Power of Beauty at the Stuart Court, which is still available, along with the other talks from that event. Those are from Gareth Russell, Professor Alice Hunt, Julian Humphreys, Katie Wignall, and yours truly. If you want to get hold of those talks, you can, for a very low fee, at buymeacoffee.com/Philippa, that's PHILIPPA, or you can follow the link in the show notes. But anyway, today we're speaking to Andrea. So, Andrea, welcome to the British History Channel. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the intriguing mistress of Charles II, Barbara Villiers.
Thank you so much for having me, Philippa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, tell us, if you wouldn't mind, a bit about yourself, how you got into history and your work.
I sort of got into the history, the historical scene, I suppose, when I was a child, and I really enjoyed visiting the art museums and historical places. I was born in Philadelphia, and there are numerous historical sites there. You have Ben Franklin's house. You have there's and nearby. I remember there was we did a field trip, I think, once to Colonial Williamsburg, and it was just so interesting. All this, and I love historical reenactment, and when people are at these sites wearing the authentic outfits, I really love that. Now, I got into Shakespeare, and from that sort of snowballed into, oh, what kind of clothing did they wear? And oh, the literature. So it was literature based for me, and the plays that opened up this wonderful century, the 17th century, to me. And I just found it so fascinating and so beautiful. I mean, the art and the music and the poetry are just sublime, in my opinion. And it really got to me. So I found lots of it moving. It's funny, I never thought I would be a writer, but this sort of developed. I wrote a biographical novella called His Last Mistress in, what was it, 2013? So well, over a decade ago now. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote The Stuart Vampire, which is a historical horror So I started off writing historical fiction, but I was simultaneously writing my not my podcast, my blog at the time, and writing articles, and I was also doing a lot of work at Kensington Palace and sometimes Hampton Court Palace. I volunteered a lot at that time. And so I was in these amazing historic spaces where these fantastic historical figures used to live and really brought it to life for me.
Mm.
And everything sort of fell into place. And so one thing led to another, and I started writing for Amberley, the Stuarts in 100 Facts. I think that's a good one for people who perhaps don't know much about the period, and so it's a good little taster. Um, and then I did a year in the life of Stuart Britain, and then I went to Pen and Sword, and I wrote Sex and Sexuality in Stuart Britain. So yes, that is quite a joke in my house because I I ended up writing a sex book. Then I wrote Ravenous, which is a biography of Barbara Villiers.
I can see how Sex and Sexuality went into Barbara Villiers with, is it Villiers or Villiers? How do you
Well,
say it?
yes. I previously would always say Villiers
Yes.
because I thought, with the I, but I was speaking to some academics and also some aristocrats, and they kept saying villas. So I just go with that now. So it's
Right. We
villas.
don't want to be
So
caught out. Right.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Well, so for people who've not heard of her, can you put her into context? Who is she? Where is she in the story of the Stuarts?
Right. Well, Barbara was the most infamous mistress of King Charles II, and she lived from 1640 to 1709. So no one really wanted to marry her because not only was she no longer a virgin, but she also still had that problem of not having any money. Her life encompassed a huge amount of change. There was a great deal of tumultuous events, many, many events during her lifetime. Civil War, plague, the Great Fire of London, the restoration of the monarchy, and going back, the Commonwealth. Uh, so many things. William and Mary. She saw so many things, and she was acquainted with so many integral historical persons that it it just became apparent to me how important it was to show her life, what she experienced in that incredible time.
Well, let's talk about her early life because she wasn't knocking around the royal court, so let's can you give us a flavour of where she came from?
Yes. Well, Barbara came into the world when it was on the verge of civil war. She was born in November 1640 to William Villiers and his wife Mary Baining. This couple came from prestigious backgrounds. Mary's family owned land, and William's grandfather had been the elder half-brother of the notorious George Villiers, first Duke of Buckingham. So many people will have heard of him. He was the great favorite not only of King James I of England, but also his son and heir, Charles I. So she came from an already notorious family who had great influence and power. Um, so already by the time of her birth, the three kingdoms were headed for a great deal of trouble. Um, so there were political and religious tensions, and these were simmering for some time. And by August of 1642, war was formally declared. Barbara's family were royalists, so they fought for King Charles I. Um, And the siege of Bristol in 1643, in particular, changed everything for the worse for Barbara and her family. Her father was 29 years old. He was fighting gallantly as a colonel general under Prince Rupert of the Rhine. But he was shot in his right leg during the attack on Prior's Hill. Although he had medical attention pretty soon after this injury occurred, uh, it was nevertheless a very, very serious injury. And he grew worse and his health deteriorated for some weeks, and he died on the 29th of September in 1643. So that left Barbara's mother, now a widow, and she was in a very difficult situation. Now Barbara lost her father when she was not even 3 years old. So this was clearly quite a blow for a small child, and to her mother to lose her husband. And so Mary was left in a very difficult situation. She was in a poor state economically and probably emotionally. And for a 17th century woman, she was also, in other words, unprotected. So, and this difficult situation was exacerbated as time went on. And by the time Barbara was 8, there was so little money that Mary decided to marry again. And this time it was to her husband's cousin, Charles. And Charles Villiers, he moved his new family to a home that he owned in London. It was on Ludgate Hill, and it was near Old St. Paul's Cathedral. And this is where Barbara pretty much grew up, and she hit puberty, and she blossomed and inherited the famous beauty that the Villiers family were reputed to have. Because George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, he was known for having great beauty, and it was the same with her. And so by the age of 15, yeah, about the age of 15, she was already getting a great deal of interest from a variety of men. But she did fall in love around 15 to one of these chaps, and that was Philip Stanhope, the second Earl of Chesterfield. He was a widower, he was older, he was handsome, and he was a bit of a bad boy. And he was very sexually experienced. And he sort of set a trend for what kind of man she would generally choose throughout her life. And she was absolutely besotted with him. He was wonderful in her eyes. He was her first love, and it was mad and passionate and all-consuming. So all the things that we experience with great love. And she would have married him, I think, because they had so much in common. They had the same political views. They had the same views in life, and their sexual appetites were aligned. So they would have made a very good and probably happy couple. Were it not for his own reluctance to marry her because she was poor.
Right.
So that's the thing. He simply wasn't prepared to marry her because she had no money. It didn't matter that she was descended from the famous Villiers family. And he was also in and out of jail for a variety of reasons. He was, as I said, a bit of a bad boy, so he was known for duels when that was frowned upon. And so this didn't help matters. So they sort of broke up. And of course, that didn't stop her having feelings for him. So by the time she was 18, so 3 years of being with Philip, she she was pretty much used goods for a lady at that time. And no one really wanted to marry her because not only was she no longer a virgin, but she also still had that problem of not having any money.
Mm.
Uh, but one man did want to marry her, and he was a very well-respected young man. He came from a good family. He was very well educated, and he had perhaps the misfortune of falling completely in love with Barbara. That man was Roger Palmer, and they married much against his father's wishes. Um, I think his father was quite a good observer of human nature, and he saw that they were very, very different from each other, and anyone could see that this was not going to work, and it certainly didn't. But they married, and Barbara very soon became disillusioned with him, and he
Mm.
with her because it didn't matter how great her beauty was. She was not the kind to sit at home and be a good wife. She wanted adventure. She wanted fun. She wanted everything.
Do you think she hoped it would work out? Do you think initially, from what
I
you said?
think that, yeah, I think she probably thought that that was the only choice that she had, the only
Mm.
option, because she didn't have many cards except her beauty, and she had
Mm.
great beauty, so that was very helpful. But she had neither money nor the virtue that was so desirable at that time. So I think she felt like she had no choice, and uh, there is some possibility that her mother urged her to get married, especially as she had a bad reputation following this
Mm.
relationship with Philip. So she might have just been pushed into this. But Roger was a very good man, so he wasn't like some others that she would come to know later on in her life.
Mm. So she's having this affair with Stanhope for 3 years. It's known about.
Yeah.
Does she have knowledge of contraception? And I'm just thinking from the point of view of the Palmer family, who she would marry into. There's kind of is there not a thought that perhaps she could, for all her beauty, and she looks, like a virile, but that actually she might be barren. Is there anything that concerns them about that? And had she remained not pregnant because she knew what she was doing, or maybe he did?
I think he knew what he was doing.
Right.
So that's the thing. She probably learned quite a good deal from him, and there have been some condoms found from the Civil War period. I think they were found in Dudley Castle. So there were methods of contraception used. Um, there were herbs as well that were known to be used at this time as well. Um, so we don't know exactly what his family would have made of Barbara in terms of potential barrenness or whatnot, but they just thought that she was not a person to be trusted, really. Um, and I think that was mainly it was her character that was found wanting.
Mm.
So I we really don't know about what their thoughts were on the other issues.
Mm. Okay. So how so she's had a 3-year relationship, then she's married. How does she come to the attention of Charles II, and when does their relationship begin?
Well, Barbara first met Charles when she was 19, so it was the year after she married Roger. When she arrived in Brussels with her husband in the winter of 1660. Traditionally, many history books talk about the relationship beginning in earnest when the newly returned king celebrated his first night in London, entwined in the arms of his lover Barbara. Although this is popularly believed to have been the first occasion on which the couple had sex, uh, the two had very strong libidos, um, and they were not restrained by any societal thoughts. Thus, it seems unlikely that they had hitherto resisted temptation. Uh, in any case, sometime between the 29th of May and the 4th of June, 1660, this is the week of Charles's return to England, Barbara became pregnant. Um, but it should be pointed out that this doesn't conclusively mean that the child conceived during this time, who was Anne, was his. She was, Barbara was at this point more than likely still sleeping with her husband Roger, but it is also possible that she had resumed sexual relations with her first love, Philip, because she did resume them when she was married. So shortly after she married Roger, she began to have, uh, she resumed her love affair with Philip. So it's quite of a tangled mess of
Yeah.
intrigues and lust here. Yeah.
Yeah. But so she went over to Bruges. So she was with Charles's sort of court, if you like, but
Mhm.
in Bruges, they went over there.
Well, there is some there's some speculation. There's different reports. So I tend to go with Brussels because that's what the Earl of
Sorry,
Clarendon
Brussels.
said. But other reports say Bruges and others
Right.
say Breda. But like the Declaration of Breda, right? Um, uh, but Charles had a base in Brussels at around this time. So it's likely that it's in Brussels. Another report said it was in The Hague. So there are lots of
Right.
different confusing ties here. Uh, but
But they
yeah,
decide to go and join Charles, though. And
yes.
is this at a time where they already know? Would they have known the Restoration was coming, or is this
No,
still a
no.
gamble on their part?
It was still a gamble, and
Mm.
they went over with £1,000, and that was a huge amount of money for them. And the only thing Roger and Barbara had in common was that they both wanted to see the restoration of the Stuarts onto the throne. So that was a big deal for them, and so they went together, and wanted to help this exiled sovereign. They wanted to see him restored more than anything. And of course, the comely bearer of this £1,000 didn't was not ignored by Charles II.
Mm.
He uh, he was a fan of the ladies, and he appreciated a good-looking lady, and she certainly was. Um, and so that's the thing. They hit it off right away. The chemistry was there. Everything was there for these
Mm.
two.
So she comes to his attention as a patron from the beginning with money and
Mhm.
clearly the willingness to. Well, it's quite dangerous for them to
Yeah.
have left at that point. But either way, it means that from the very beginning of Charles II's reign, when he comes back in 1660, she's there.
Yeah. She's there. Absolutely. And right before he was no, he knew he was going to be restored. He was sending letters to his sister Minette, who lived in France, and uh, and she was complaining about him spending time with somebody else, and he wrote back saying, "Oh, don't worry, I still love you and everything." And I think that the person they were referring to, because sadly one of the letters is gone, so we can't know exactly who they were talking about, but it seems likely that they were referring to Barbara because she was definitely in his life by that point and making her presence known.
Wow. So how was their relationship viewed then? Let's say once he's back, so at court. Um, and well, I suppose, and further afield. What's the attitude towards their relationship?
Well, people in general were in this state of, uh, well, we're just going to allow him his pleasures. It's fine. But of course, there was this feeling that, oh, she's being an adulteress, and that was not something that was viewed upon favorably.
Mm.
It was a very bad thing and sometimes punished quite severely. However, people in general were quite charitable with Charles in the beginning, especially in the beginning of the reign. And so they were able to forgive his proclivities in that respect. Yeah.
You do write in your book quite a bit about Barbara's relationship with Charles's mother, Henrietta Maria. What was their relationship like?
Well, one would think that it wouldn't have been a good relationship, but they got on really well.
Mm.
And Henrietta Maria came from the French court. Of course, she was born and raised in France, and she understood that men, these royal men, had mistresses. It was just normal for her. And so she didn't really look down upon it. I mean, she herself didn't have to have any trouble because her husband Charles I was, famed for his loyalty towards her. And so she didn't have to have so much conflict about that personally. But she was pretty laid back when it came to adultery with royals. But she hit it off really well with Barbara. Barbara had a very fun personality, when she was having a good time. When she wasn't having a good time, that's an entirely different matter. Um, but she got on really well, and so much so, uh, Henrietta Maria left her money in her will. So they had this really pleasant relationship. Henrietta Maria was like a de facto mother-in-law for Barbara, especially how when she started having children, this was, of course, the grandma. Henrietta Maria was the grandma of these children, so it was all pretty close. And when Barbara converted to Roman Catholicism, that I think brought them together even more because Henrietta Maria loved a convert to the Roman Catholic
Mm.
Church. It's great. Yeah, she
We'll,
really
we'll
approved of that.
I bet. Yes, of course. We'll come back to that because I want to ask you
Okay.
about that in a
Mhm.
while. Um, but so Barbara's clearly got a strong relationship with Charles from sounds like from the moment they set eyes on each other.
Pretty much.
She's in with the mother-in-law would be. So
Mhm.
she seems quite present. Does she ever wield political influence with the king?
Yes. And it's funny because it's a mixture of politics and social drama at the same time. Um, I I think we have to talk about the events surrounding the bedchamber crisis, right?
Yes, I understood.
Um,
Yes. Okay, go.
yeah.
Yes, you go for it.
Okay. Um, well, of course, there was this situation in which King Charles II needed to marry and sire legitimate heirs. He already had quite a few illegitimate children by this point, early 1660s. Um, and and so it was decided with him and Clarendon, who was a major minister at the time, Edward Hyde, that he should marry the Portuguese Infanta, who was Catherine of Braganza. And so she came over and they were married in 1662. But Barbara was a bit worried about this time. She had already maybe a couple of years being this supremely powerful royal mistress for the king. And she loved her position And she finally had what she wanted so much since she was a child, the the wealth, the beautiful dresses, the jewelry, the opulent apartments. She had everything that she wanted because she had the king around her little finger. He was wrapped around that good and tight. Um, and so she was really enjoying her position. And finally, suddenly, she knew, oh, right, he has to get married. And this, of course, was annoying for her because she was, in effect, his wife. She was the uncrowned queen. She had that position. She was the mother of his children by now, everything. And she was the person people had to go to in order to get to the king. So she was really powerful. Um, and the problem is when Catherine came over, there were factions developing. Some were like pro Catherine, who would be the legitimate queen and wife. And there were others who were still Camp Barbara. And so Pepys noted, he observed that one evening at the play house while these things were going on and people were leaving Barbara's side to be with the queen who was coming shortly, that she looked downcast, almost nervous, apprehensive. And this is not something that's in her character. She was very strong and lofty and imperious. So she wasn't saddled with self-doubt in any way, usually. But he thought that there was something that was dragging her down, and she felt like that she was going to lose this position that she had wanted so much. She wanted this power. And she was feeling that she was going to have it taken away from her by this new woman. And so she somehow let off that there was this rumor that she was going to have her lying in, because she was pregnant again. She was going to have her lying in at Hampton Court Palace, which was going to be the honeymoon retreat for the newlyweds. And so there was this big deal made about this, and oh my goodness, she's going to have her child where they were going to have their honeymoon. So lots of rumors were swirling about, and she saw Catherine as the other woman, the way we see a married couple and a mistress being the other woman. No, for Barbara, she was the wife, she was the queen. This was a new person. This was a threat. But unfortunately for Catherine, Barbara was very formidable. And she didn't really stand a chance, even though she was pious, virtuous, all the things that a 17th century lady should be at that time. Barbara was the opposite. And so what happened was Barbara was insisting on being the first lady of the bedchamber. And this was a huge position, very influential, even though her own rank was low compared to other ladies that should have been. And so she should have been last in this group of ladies. But for Queen Catherine, of course, the mere idea of having the infamous Lady Castlemaine, as she was at the time, as one of her most honored ladies was absolutely reprehensible. It was humiliating that anyone would even put that forth. And it was also hugely disrespectful. Now, another lady of the bedchamber, Jane, Lady Gerard, I believe, sided with Queen Catherine and made it known that she also disagreed with honoring Barbara with this coveted position. For her efforts, she was subjected to a scene of huge public humiliation by King Charles II, and this scene upset her so much that she left court. Barbara ultimately persuaded Charles to her side of the issue. One day, Charles brazenly escorted Barbara into the Queen's apartments in front of a large assembly of courtiers. And there he introduced her in such a manner that the Queen was quite innocent She innocently welcomed Barbara with grace, and even let her kiss her hand. It was only when one of her Portuguese attendants, her ladies, whispered down to her and said, "That's actually the king's mistress," that Catherine apparently lost control, and she had a massive nosebleed very, very soon after.
Oh.
It affected her so badly. Um, and so emotional stress suddenly. And so she shrieked with indignation, and she displayed a rare fit of temper, which Barbara usually had. But she eventually Barbara won. That's in a nutshell. She won, and she became the first lady of the bedchamber, and that set a precedent for the rest of Catherine's marriage with.
So she's got Charles's ear, and now she's so she has access to the Queen whenever she wishes as well.
Yep. Yep.
So how did that go? Did she actually turn up for work? That's the other thing.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. She did. She wasn't she did what she wanted. Barbara was very much doing what she wanted. So she was quite happy to have won this and won this position. Yep.
No.
Yeah.
Poor Catherine.
Yes. She was a great lady, Catherine. And but no one could play the game as well as Barbara could at the time. Yeah.
How many? You've already mentioned that she's been pregnant a number of times. How many children did Barbara and Charles have together in the end?
Well, it's usually said to be 5, but I am not sure about one of them. So the first one, I really don't know if we can count Anne because of her appearance. She seems to have looked a great deal like Philip. So according to contemporaries at the time. So between 4 and 5, I'd say.
Right. But does Charles recognize them all as his?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yep. There were some later children who were not acknowledged. And so she got pregnant with her lover, Harry German, and she wanted Charles to acknowledge that child as his own, but he refused because he hadn't been sleeping with Barbara for it to make any sense. And she lost that baby, and Charles was by her side quite often during her recuperation. So even though they had enormous rows in before the baby was lost, he was still there by her side as she recuperated. And then she had a daughter with John Churchill, who became the first Duke of Marlborough, who was a distant cousin of hers. Yeah.
Oh, yes, of course, Sarah Churchill's future husband.
Yes. And his relation and Churchill's relationship with Barbara was not a subject that Sarah Jennings enjoyed.
No.
And she never liked that.
I imagine there's another formidable woman.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So you mentioned that she did endear herself to the mother of Charles II by various things, having grandchildren for her, being quite fun. But this conversion from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism in 1663, I believe. Why did she make that change? And was that not quite a dangerous thing to do at this time?
Well, we would think that given the climate of religious tensions and everything, that would have been a very bad thing to do. But it was in a period in which it was sort of trendy to be a Roman Catholic. in the upper echelons of society, in the
Mm.
small courtier world. And so, yeah, there were a few Catholics. I mean, you had the conversion of Anne, who was the Duchess of York. She became a Catholic. And of course, her husband, James, later James II, he also converted. And so there were quite a few of these really high-ranking royals and courtiers and aristocrats who converted to Roman Catholicism. Maybe because it was, as I said, sort of trendy, and also it's a bit naughty to do.
Mm.
So it's very much a sort of restoration. They lived in a sort of world of their own because um and and later, of course, there would be in the late 70s, there would be the Popish plot. And so a great deal of hatred and anti-Popish sentiment was spread, and it led to deaths. So it could be very dangerous. But I think the highest person involved in the Popish plot later was Edward Coleman, who was the secretary for the second Duchess of York. So it could be very dangerous, but I think Barbara did that because she wanted to, further ingratiate herself, be, pally with her mother-in-law, so to speak. Um, but we don't really know exactly what her motivations were for the conversion.
I mean, she doesn't strike me as someone who um, is too bothered by what other people are going to say, or almost like she would court a little bit of. Well, yeah, she's not fearful of courting controversy, is she?
No. No. No, she really didn't care what most people thought about her, but she didn't like being called a whore or being compared to Jane Shore, who was the mistress of Edward IV. She had a few incidents in which people referred to her as, as the new Jane Shore, and so she really would get quite annoyed about that. So she was funny because she often didn't care what anyone thought about her. She liked to push the boat. Um, she liked to do things her way, but at the same time, she didn't like to be called certain things. It did bother her.
Is that because she saw her relationship with Charles as it's a genuine one as opposed to a frivolous one? I mean, by this point,
Yeah.
they've been together for quite a long time.
Yeah, well, they were like a married couple. They had good times and bad times and everything in between. And the longevity with which she had this relationship, it was no superficial relationship.
Mm.
They had very deep ties over the years. Um, Even though neither of them was particularly faithful to the other, they still had this pull, this great attraction. And I don't think that Charles ever really got over her. She was always very special to him.
Mm. How did their relationship develop over time? Because obviously we know he had other mistresses. You've already mentioned she has at least another couple of lovers. But I mean, are they still in a sort of relationship up until, I think, does he predecease her?
Yes, he does.
Yes.
He died in 1685 and she died in 1709.
Right.
So,
So by quite a long way,
yeah,
actually. Mm.
yeah. Um, yeah, she was very special to him, and there's this idea, this notion that Charles II cut her off completely in 1670 because he was totally tired of her and didn't want anything to do with her. And from my research, I just don't think that was the case. It's clearly not the case. Um, she was in his heart until his death in 1685. He was in letters. I came across some copies of letters when I was in the Chatsworth archives, and I came across these, and I didn't think that they were going to be there. The documents were supposed to be something else, like bills, and I was just wanted to have a look. And then I found these copies of letters sent up about uh, about Barbara and from Barbara to Charles during this time, and mind blown. I couldn't believe what I found there. And it proved to me that he did continue to have feelings for her. Uh, he was concerned about her behavior with a young Marquis de Chatillon, who was her lover in France, because she moved after, in sometime in the 1670s, she moved to France, and she was very much in the whole French court scene of Louis XIV. So she was pals with Louis XIV as well, and he gave her good, costly gifts and everything. So she made her she placed her stamp in France as well. But going back to his letters, Charles II was concerned about her behavior and was worried that she was being taken advantage of by this young upstart Frenchman. And he was worried about the potential impact this had on their children. Uh, so there was this thing. Um, And of course, John Evelyn wrote in February of 1685 that she had returned to England, and she was in Charles II's company in the last few days before he died. They were all gaming, and several of his, Evelyn put it, his concubines were enjoying an evening's entertainment and enjoying each other's company. And that a few days later it was all dust because everything ended with Charles's death. Um, but he had bestowed upon her not only the the title of Countess of Castlemaine, but also the Duchess of Cleveland, the Countess of Southampton, the Baroness of Nonsuch. Um,
Mm.
and so it's all he did care about her, and it never really ended. Her position really was taken over in effect by Louise de Querouaille. She was quite a powerful mistress as well, um, but a very different sort of person as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
So did she did she resent when other mistresses came on the scene, or was she more of a pragmatist than that?
No one really bothered her, or was much of a threat until I'd say Frances Stuart, and that was around 1663, so rather early.
Mm.
Um, and Charles was quite besotted by this young girl who was the opposite of Barbara. I mean, she appeared to be a bit silly, very uh, sort of young, of course, at that age. She liked to play games. And some people, including the second Duke of Buckingham, thought that maybe she should be angled to be the next queen because there was some talk that Charles should divorce Catherine because she wasn't having any children and
Mm.
marry someone else who could provide an heir. And some were trying to push Frances Stuart forward. But this is the only person really who really um, worried Barbara.
And was that the difference? The fact that she was actually being put forward as potential wife material, not just another
Well,
mistress?
not just that. There was perhaps that because Frances was unmarried, and so she wasn't. It wasn't like the same situation that Barbara had had being married and not being able to marry Charles, if even that were possible.
Mm.
But it's the sort of obsession with which Charles pursued her. He became very, very much a sort of almost like sexually obsessed with her because she was this virtuous girl, and she's the one who said no. I She was the only one who said no. I don't want anything to do with you. And so he sort of hounded this young lady, um, and she finally fell in love with somebody else, um, and she eloped with that man, and that was great for Barbara. She enjoyed that Francis was no longer a threat.
Mm.
But later there were these actresses like Moll Davis and Nell Gwynn and Hortense Mancini. Um, uh, and the funny thing is, Hortense was one of the prospective wives at one point, but her family member, who was Cardinal Mazarin of France, totally poo-pooed the notion of her being married to Charles II, because at the time he was quite penniless in exile. And so for them to eventually become lovers about 2 decades later is quite something.
Mm.
But then when that affair died off, she ended up having a lesbian relationship with his daughter, perhaps with Barbara Anne. So it was so he had a relationship with Hortense Mancini, and then she had one with his daughter. So it's like, again, we have all these sexual intrigues and connections between these figures.
I mean, it does make the court of Charles II sound like something, I don't know, something else, something
Well,
quite beyond the norms of any age,
yeah.
actually.
Yeah, I mean, people say, oh, the modern royals are very much full of tabloid fodder and stuff like that, but they have nothing compared to what was happening at Charles II's time.
No, it's like a web. I mean,
Yeah,
every mistress of his had other lovers, and it's just, yeah,
yeah.
wow, must have been quite complex. Well, they must have just rubbed along together and not, sorry, excuse the pun, but not, they can't have sort of thought much about all of this. Can they? You know, you said about the sort of playing cards together and enjoying the entertainments together. Is that
Yeah,
really how is that generally how it worked?
pretty much. I mean, some people would be upset. Of course, it's human nature
Mm,
to have envy and jealousy. And um, I mean, this didn't last very long, of course. I mean, in the next reigns, especially in that of William and Mary, the moral pendulum went all the way to the other side. So it was
mm,
totally different. Um, so yeah, I think it was a bit of a blip really here, but
mm,
it does have there's this sort of sense that it was all fun and everything, but no, it was actually very it could be quite dangerous for people, and people were looked upon, especially young women, young pretty women were looked upon like prey for
mm.
some of these courtiers, and it could be a very dark place where,
When reading the bit in your book about Francis Stewart,
yeah,
um, made Charles, you know, made me sort of take a moment to think about
mm,
Charles's behaviour in that situation with how young
yeah,
Francis was and how,
yeah,
you know, what was attracting him to her, being
mm,
that she's young and a virgin, and that relentless pursuit of her.
yeah,
Um, yeah, it was really quite difficult to read about, really.
mm.
It was so predatory.
Yeah, it was, and he wasn't the only one. He wasn't always like that. It was just
No,
in
but
that scene. Yeah, but there were others who were the libertines at court. You have people like Rochester, and Sedley, and all these characters. And yeah, we can look at them and think, oh, that's fun. Yeah, blah blah. But no, it was very uncomfortable. And some people were hurt. Um, and yeah, there's this double nature to it that's something to consider when we look at this
Mm,
time period.
mm, mm.
Not all fun and games, really.
No, where human relationships are never all of that, especially when
Mm,
sex is involved. I would
yeah.
suggest.
Mm.
So what happens to Barbara after Charles dies?
Well, we'd think that she'd have a quiet life after that, but she she did have some more lovers and adventures with with them. Um, she became attached to an actor called Cardinal Goodman, um, and he had a nickname, and that was Scum.
Oh,
And there's good reason for this. He does come across as quite a scummy character. So yeah, again, it was that bad boy thing that she did like. She did like the bad boys. Um, and these choices she made sometimes were not in her best interest, quite often. Um, so she had situations with him, and he was found to have tried to poison her sons. So, and he was enjoying living the life of Riley with her. He had a room in her apartments in her house, and I came across this in the National Archives, and I found it said the some ironmonger had to create a new key. He was good at smashing things up in this place that he lived in with her, and so they had to give a new key. It was made for that lock. Seems to have been broken, so must have, I think, burst the door open or something. Again, we have these sort of violent characters, and she very often allowed her lovers to take care of her financial matters.
oh,
And so she had problems with her finances. She was really into gambling and really bad at it. So she lost huge sums of money, huge sums, more than people made in a year of working
mm,
in Stuart Britain. So um, it was very unfortunate for her that she had this propensity to make poor choices, I think. That's what we would say now.
mm. Is she always following, or is she always sort of seeking out drama? She would never have been someone who wanted to live a quiet life anyway.
Yeah, she was no wallflower.
Mm,
That's certainly. Um, but whether or not she wanted to seek out drama, I don't know. She naturally attracted it due to her
right.
own natural inclinations. She, I believe, was a lover of love. She wanted that excitement, that thrill of a chase and conquest. So it was, in a way, she was like some of the males around her at court, but she set her sights on something. When she wanted something, she would get it, and if she didn't get it, she would make a tremendous, tremendous scene about it. And if there was a man she wanted as her lover, she would, by and large, get him. So she knew what she wanted. I suppose you can say that's a good thing. She knew what she wanted, and she was uh, ready to do whatever it took
Yeah.
to get it.
Relentless in the pursuit of it.
Mhm.
What kind of mother was she?
Well, I don't think we could say she was very maternal in the way that we expect mums to be. Um, there are some reports of her being rather cruel to her children sometimes. Um, I remember reading something where one of her sons had his teeth were coming out poorly. They were all wonky, and this was in the days before modern dentistry, of course. And so she had him tied up, and people had to. Servants were told to remove this, and he was the same child who had some, I believe, some mental impairment. So he already had some trouble. Um, and some people were unkind about him and his faculties later. Um, but I think that shows something when she didn't like how his teeth were coming out, and so that's just one thing. But in her will, she left a few items to her children and grandchildren, but she left her daughter Barbara out. Barbara, little Barbara was her youngest daughter, and she grew up and had her own drama. She fell in love with someone and had a child out of wedlock. And by that point, of course, that was during the time of William and Mary. So this was absolutely clamped down upon, and something that her mother used to do without much shame, was punished. So she was sent off to a convent in France, and she never left. So it's very sad what happened to little Barbara. Um, and she never uh, was much to do with anyone. I mean, her father, we believe, was George. I mean, not George. Her father was John Churchill, and I think he had nothing to do with her. So she became a nun at this abbey, this nunnery. So yeah, she was punished for falling in love and having a child. So I think that's sad.
That is very sad, just as her parents had done. But again, we've mentioned John Churchill. I'm sure Sarah Jennings, his wife, was not going to allow any kind of
Hmm.
contact. Mm.
No.
Um, Now, we do have many Tudor fans watching, probably. So you've mentioned she became, was it Baroness of Nonsuch? You said was one
Yes.
of her titles.
Yes, that's right.
Tell us what she did to the palace.
Okay. This is probably the topic about which she is most known. Um, yes, Barbara is absolutely reviled for her hand in the destruction of Nonsuch Palace. Um, and before I started my research for this book, I took that for granted and I assumed it to be true. That said, the evidence and the context of her actions paint a slightly different story, if you will.
Oh,
Um, yes, she had enormous gambling debts. Yes, she frittered her money away um, to maintain her luxurious lifestyle, but that's just part of the story. Nonsuch was but one of several palaces to be destroyed or damaged in the 17th century. Richmond Palace, in which I think Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, that was ruined in the civil wars and was never rebuilt. The Palace of Placentia or Greenwich Palace,
mm.
that was demolished by Charles II. Oatlands Palace, that was another beautiful Tudor palace that was destroyed during the Stuart period as well. But it suffered great dilapidation too, and it was bought by a fellow named Robert Turbridge, and that happened during the interregnum. So, between in the 1650s, if you will. Um, and Turbridge had Oatlands destroyed and its bricks and other materials sold. Then that was 20 years before Barbara even got her hands on Nonsuch. So to say that Barbara was unique in dismantling a Tudor palace is wrong, because she was just doing what was practical.
The precedent had been set.
Yeah, and not only that, it was in a very poor state. It was in a very poor state of disrepair. Um, and so it would have cost a huge amount of money, enormous amount of money to use it. And there is evidence, there are iron works that were there are features for a fireplace that were made, they were commissioned for her to be used in Nonsuch. So she did want to think, she was perhaps considering living at Nonsuch, but it was too prohibitively expensive.
Mm.
And that's why she decided to sell this thing because it was crumbling. It was in ruins. So it made sense at that time.
All right. I mean, from my understanding about Nonsuch, and I'm not an architectural expert in any way, shape, or form, but that the material that Nonsuch was made of, which of course gave it this amazing these decorative features,
Mm.
but it was never going to really survive for very long with the English
No,
weather,
right.
regardless.
Yes, and I think, yeah, Gareth Russell was on my live show a few months ago, and he made a really good point that structures that were built under Wolsey, like Hampton Court Palace, that they were very well made, good
Mm,
quality and good construction. However, the ones that were built for Henry VIII may have been done in a quick manner, and so they were probably shoddily done, not to the best
mm,
of of quality. And so this probably is part of the reason for the extreme dilapidation which we find these palaces to be in
mm,
during the Stuart period. And so they were left, these Stuarts were left not only with the destruction and damage with the wars, which of course were horrendous,
mm.
but they also had uh, these buildings that were so old and not really fit for using, unfortunately. As much as we feel bad about that now, I think we have to think about it more practically. And yeah, yeah,
Yeah. We do, we do, we do. I mean, we wouldn't be very, people don't take on houses now and preserve the way that they are when they move into them. We all update and change.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us about Barbara. We're going to be moving on to some bonus questions that I've got from my members of my Patreon shortly. But before we do that, I've got two final questions,
Okay.
if I may, which I put to all my guests um, as we end the main part of the interview. The first one is, so you're known for the Stuart era, but do you have another period of history which you enjoy reading about, learning about? You know, one that you just enjoy, that you just enjoy. It's just for fun for you. Do you have another one?
I think I do really love the ancient histories, ancient Rome, ancient Greece. Um, and Yeah, because one of my university degrees was in anthropology, and I was thinking about being an anthropologist. But I also like to be clean, and I didn't much appreciate 2 weeks in digging, uh, and that was quite dirty. So I went off that. But I love I love archaeology and all that stuff. But yeah, just to find anything like I love the different cultures around the world, and I'm a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to where I come from. So I like to learn about that. I have ancestors from Croatia and some Spain and Chile in South America. So I have these all these different things. So I like the Incas and the Mapuches in South America. I like the Vikings. I have a bit of Swedish in me too. So I like Viking history, and I was really into that when my daughter had to learn about the Vikings. So everything. It's just such a joy to be able to learn about other cultures
Mm.
and peoples and their stories and things that they loved and their music. And I just love it all. It's wonderful.
So, what do you think we can learn from history? What do you think well, oh, yeah, what do you think we can learn from history? Why do we bother learning about the past?
I think we can learn a great deal in terms of human achievement and human frailty and so much. I think things are cyclical. They you see things come and go, and there are so many things that our ancestors had to deal with that we are in some respects dealing with today. I mean, the same sort of things. We have to deal with the loss of loved ones, of you know pestilence, disease and poverty, everything. I mean, life, as we know it. life can hit you. Yeah, it can blindside you sometimes, and you get and for me, seeing what has happened to other people, that provides not only a continuity but also comfort.
Yeah, I love that answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll be moving on to the bonus section. I've got a couple of questions for you about what's including things about like Charles's intentions for Barbara. But before we do that, because that's a patron only section, can you tell everyone else where they can find you and your work online?
Right. Well, I have a website. It's www.andreazuvich.com. You can also do 17thcenturylady.com. But I'm mainly on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Threads and X and everything. Even on TikTok. Goodness help me.
Wow, you got in there.
Yeah. But I'm at 17, so it's 17THCENTURYLADY. That's pretty much my handle, 17th Century Lady. And if you're interested in 17th century history, and you want to be part of a lovely community of enthusiasts, you can partake in Stuart Saturday, which I do every Saturday on X in particular. We have a really good community there, really kind and passionate people about Stuart history. And it's something I've done for about a decade now. And once a month, I do a live streamed online show called Stuart Saturday Live. And we did one yesterday. So we do it once a month. And my husband does he's the director and everything. So it's a family thing. And I like it to be a family oriented program. So because my daughter is going to turn 8 tomorrow. And so it's nice to have her involved and so she's the assistant producer. So she helps.
Oh,
And it's fantastic. And I'm really lucky to be able to have what I find interesting conversations with some brilliant historians and historical novelists. And I just find it's a lovely bit that you can enjoy in your afternoon on a Saturday in between lunch and perhaps going out for a Saturday evening.
well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. The possibility that the hatred that some felt towards her could turn into physical violence, and that she could be murdered was never too far from her mind.
For more of this interview, go to patreon.com/British history, where you can join my Patreon and next time ask your own questions of my guest.